Welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives. Today we're going to discuss feminist artists, and the people discussing will be Jill Raymond and Batya Weinbaum. So thanks very much for coming, and over to you, Jill and Batya.
Hi, good morning or afternoon, everyone, wherever you are. I'm happy to be here and excited that we get to discuss this topic. We're going to be discussing the feminist art movement. I'm going to start by discussing the feminist art movement of the 60s and 70s, and then we're going to progress from there historically. I want to start by saying that I was doing a mural on the streets in Mexico, and somebody came up to me and said, "Oh, this reminds me of the art in the 70s in New York City." He pegged me because that's exactly where I was in the 70s. And so there was a certain kind of aesthetic of art involving the street art, involving the audience, and breaking down the barrier between the participants and the onlookers and people making the art. And one of the reasons for that was because conceptual art and street art and performance art weren't all sewn up by the guys. And we're going to hear how very limited the participation of women in traditional art was at the time. But the feminist art movement was very big in the 60s and 70s. There were art institutes. I myself went to the Women's Inter-Art Center in New York City. I studied film there. And it was founded in the late 60s and early 70s. They wrote a big grant for $55,000, and they actually demonstrated in front of the Grant Institute that wasn't giving them money. And they got about $5,000 to start off, and they did video festivals. And it was a very interactive place with all the like the name says, with all the different mediums, which was also traditional. To be interdisciplinary in the arts, very exciting place to be. It was over in Westbeth, which was an area where lots of artists were living together in cheap housing. Another thing I wanted to start explaining was that you yourselves can read very much about the feminist art movement and see historical documents of it. If you want to look at Heresies of Feminist Publication of Politics in the Arts. Bernadette, can you show the first slide, please? This was a publication that was published between 1977 and 1993. It was an idea-oriented journal that came out of New York City. The founders were Mary Beth Edelson, Miriam Shapiro, Lucy Lepard, and Joyce Kozloff. There were a lot of different issues. This is the one on violence. There were issues on feminism, art and politics, lesbian art, the great goddess, women working together on women in violence, the third world, the politics of aesthetics, women in music, the sex issue, feminism and ecology. The way it functioned was there was an overall collective of these four names that I just said, the Mother Collective, and then they would pick one of these themes and they would organize a collective to run each issue. So everything was done collectively. On the racism issue, they even published a transcript of the dialogue within the editorial board. In the violence issue, I wanted to show you the aesthetic of how visual each issue was. Like they played typographically with everything, and they were very interdisciplinary. They published photographs, they published art, they published people who were not known. They published known people. If you go back and look at the issues, you're going to see like Ntozake Shange, you're going to see people that you know of, and you're going to see people that you never heard of. And it didn't matter who you were. We were all just in a big bubble. Everybody was creating work together. And the columns were laid out creatively. The headlines were laid out creatively. They used comic art. Zines were produced later on, but they started using zines. And so everything was political, which was new in that period as well. The point of the feminist art movement was to seek to create a dialogue between the viewer, the audience. In this case, this is a kind of a prose piece that I wrote about being raped, and there was a dialogue in the collective about whether they wanted to publish both parts of what I had written. And they sent the one member of the collective to talk with me, and then they decided to print the transcript of what the member of the collective had written about with me. So in this case, it was interactive with the author, which is, very, very avant-garde. Journals never did anything like this. So everything along the way was always interactive. In one of the other issues, there was a issue number 14, the women's papers, the women's pages, they left one page blank that was intentionally left. Oh, yeah, that was the editorial statement of the racism issue. I wanted to show you that so it wasn't just the editors sitting on a chair writing things. They actually taped the conversation, so everybody's voice got included in there. This is very typical of the period of how collective it all was. And so everyone's voice got heard. And in the women's pages, there was a blank piece of paper left in there so that you could put in your own writing or your own art as a audience member or a consumer of the journal, so that you were part of the collective voice. They were very dedicated to getting all women's voices heard. That was their point of view. And I wanted to make sure that everybody knew, because the second wave is often put down for being elitist or white, but they had a Latina issue, they had a third world issue, they had a feminism and ecology issue, they had an issue on age. The food and feminist issue was very well known. Susie Orbach published in that. They had a Latina issue. And they had a motherhood issue as well, which is a topic that's come up in our discussions here. So it was an amazing thing. If you just put it, how many heresies PDF, you can find all of these on file, and I really recommend it to anybody who's interested in the second wave or who's interested in art. You'll find it very inspiring. Okay, so now I'm going to go on to another feminist art institute besides the Women's Inter-Art Center that was in New York City. There was the mother of all the feminist art institutes was the one in California, the Feminist Arts Program. Miriam Shapiro also co-founded that with Judy Chicago. And one of the famous pieces, of course, is the Woman House. And it was this, I have some slides of here. Woman House was created in 1972. It was a big house that was bought and they renovated it. And it was a month-long exhibit, and 10,000 people came. People who'd never thought about the women's movement came before, because it was a big construction project in the neighborhood. And Judy thought teaching women how to use construction tools was as important as making the art. And they put a piece of performance art in every single room. So they had, can you go through the slides? This is the outside of the house. But so they did theater. This was one of the plays they put on. You can see it was phallic penetration. This was very risque at the time. Let's go on to the next slide. This was this was the bathroom. It was famous because it had used Kotex in the bathroom. So it was using women's intimate things as part of making you look at things that were related to women's hygiene as part of art. Which is kind of amazing if you think about it, that this was made to be part of art. Let's go to the next slide. I don't know what that white box is, but let's go to the next slide. Yeah, Through the Flowers is a very good book. Okay, here's a bigger picture of the bathroom. Some other shots of the bathroom. Let's just keep going through the slides. It's pretty amazing that they had 10,000 people go through this exhibit. And they had like breasts put up in the kitchen that looked like, okay, and here was like the bride at the top of the stairs. She would stand there, and then let's keep going. And all of these were, okay, so this is the kitchen. You see these are breasts or sunny side up eggs, whichever way the light caught. The kitchen was completely red. So women got their names on these rooms, which was one of the controversial things. Okay, and here's the woman getting ready to put on her makeup and go out in the world. The woman sitting in front of the vanity was part of the woman's house thing. And women were doing this kind of performance art in houses. When I was an artist in residence at the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana, and women were doing in the 80s, and women were doing something similar to this. So it kind of caught on as a phase of something that women could do creatively for themselves in their own environment. So it was okay. So this direct interaction with the audience to teach them about, get the viewer to question the social political landscape from a woman's perspective was a big part of what was going on in the feminist art movement in the 60s and the 70s. So another, spectatorship is another term that was used. Now let's go on to Betsy Damon. She did a famous piece called The 7,000-Year-Old Woman from 1977 to 79. You can find her webpage as well. She inaugurated a series of performance pieces using the epitomization of female presence. We have a film we can show from her website, which is kind of blurry and it's very long. We're not going to watch the whole thing, but you can get a sense. This is a woman sitting with bags of sand, plastic. Another woman rolls a string ball around her. And they did this in the middle of the street corner. And women were like and chanting around. I'm picturing. So making it what would done for 7,000 years, which is to, clean up, basically doing this very tedious ongoing work. So there was a lot of work like this on street corners that made women and other people sit up and look at the work that women do, which is usually invisible. And showing videos on street corners was also a big thing, and we'll get into this later when we talk about political art. But in the late 80s and 90s in Israel and Palestine, Women in Black did this. They took slides of what was going on in the territories and showed it on street corners in Tel Aviv and different busy street corners in Israel. And this made people sit up and look at what was going on in the territories in ways that they hadn't seen before. So women's feminist art was making the invisible visible. That was a big tenet. There was one woman, Valerie, who used to stand with a box, Valerie Export, and underneath her breasts were naked, and people could like put their hands in and touch her breasts, and that she did that on a busy street corner. So that was like making the invisible visible. There was a lot of working with images of goddesses on street corners, which is what the guy meant when he said that my art seemed like the 70s feminist art movement. And before feminism, women had been hardly visible in the art world at all, as we're going to see when we watch the Guerrilla Girls film. And one of the best books you can read if you want to read more about the situation of women in the art world overall and how it began to change is Whitney Chaddock's Woman, Art, and Society, which I taught for 9 years at Empire State College. And another excellent book is to read Elizabeth Barber, Women's Work, the First 20,000 Years, which actually looks at women's crafts work as art, which was another big reclamation that was made in the feminist art movement. Was it's not just art that gets in galleries, it's what we do in the streets to make people aware of women's art, but it's also the crafts work that women have done for thousands of years that also we need to look at as art. So with that, I'm going to look at the chat while we turn ourselves over to our second expert participant in the feminist art movement, which is my colleague, Ray. Thank you.
Okay. Right. I'm gonna pick this up at 1981. I managed to get to America. I had a dispute with the landlord, so I didn't have anywhere to live, but I got the rent back. So I went to New York on a bit of a whim, really. And I came across the New York Feminist Art Institute, which was something that I think followed on from what Batya was talking about. I managed to get to some of the program in the autumn, and that's also where I met the New York chapter of the Women's Pentagon Action. So the program here, thanks Bernadette, that's a cover for that term. The next slide actually is the list of workshops. The program included full-time courses, evening classes, special events, open house, and weekend, special weekend programs. So I went to the life drawing evenings. There was no instructor, and it was directed by the group, in fact, and we took turns to be the models. I'd done a traditional sort of art school training in London in the 70s, early 70s. So they, like for the life drawing, we sat in a circle around the model, and we all had a different color pencil. So we had 5 minutes at each easel, and we did 5 minutes of drawing of the model, and then we all moved round a seat. We took our pencil with us, and we left the paper behind, and we worked all the way round until we got back to our original seat, so that the finished drawing had a contribution from everybody in it, and it was all different colored pencils. So it was very exciting. I found it very exciting to be drawing in this collaborative techniques. Then some of the other classes that were on offer were explorations of self as sculpture, graphics and mechanicals, which was mainly about printing and production. The artist as a self-employed person, because we were self-employed, and that's a whole other part of the work, really. Woodworking in carpentry, creating performance art, journal writing, which is still quite popular, and the responsibilities of a feminist art criticism. So yeah, through that I got involved with the New York chapter of the Women's Pentagon Action. That was the second Pentagon Action. I think Batya was at it as well. We didn't know each other then. And it grew, I think it grew very much out of what was happening around performance art, street art. So there was, it encompassed guerrilla theatre and ritual, there was pageant, and it led up to civil disobedience. Batya, you've got the first couple of slides, please, for the Women's Pentagon Action. This was this was grew also out of the Women for Life on Earth movement, and it was in 4 stages: mourning, rage, empowerment, and defiance. So for the morning, I'd become part of the affinity group in the New York Feminist Pentagon group. We went to Washington the day before, and we spent a day in a stadium making like simple tombstones with the name of a woman who's been killed by patriarchy. So these could be quite historical. They might have been someone's sister. There were a lot of these things, and we walked with those in silence through the Arlington Cemetery, which is a military cemetery, very military set out. We walked in silence with a slow drum beat, and then we emerged out of that and moved. There's the planting. This is part of the mourning ceremony on this slide. We planted these women that we were remembering on the grounds of the Pentagon Action, in front of the Pentagon, the grass. And then we raised up out of that, having done our mourning. We were keeling and howling, and then we moved into rage, which was a faster drum beat, and we were yelling and screaming, stomping, and we moved towards the Pentagon as a building. So then the next section was empowerment, which meant that we were moving into the circling the Pentagon. And then the last bit was, in this slide, defiance. So we blockaded it. There were affinity groups that were doing this. And the blockading was done like weaving these webs across the steps. And that made it impossible for the guys that were trying to get in and out, to arrest the women that were lying underneath. They had to go and get scissors. And this was 4 of the gates, 4 of the main gates on the steps. The Watergate wasn't so easy to get to. And so it was a big build-up. There was a lot of work involved in getting there, and there were women that came from all over America in different affinity groups, basically, to take part in this and have their specific roles. I wanted to elaborate on that because we discussed it a bit last night after the presentation with Leah and the video of them outside the Dana Rivers court hearing. So so the web weaving was an important part. We were using that at Greenham as well, and Greenham had only just started, and we used webs massively there as well. And they were a womanly sort of thing to use, but in a defiant way. And that was for me, that was radical. I think for a lot of us that was radical. I was based in the West Country, and there was 10 women that had been arrested at Greenham who appeared in Totnes Magistrates Court. And all over the country, women that had been arrested at Greenham were being heard, their cases were being heard in their local towns, because there's hundreds and hundreds of us. It was too many to all appear in Reading and Newbury near Greenham. So we went into the magistrates court very silent, very respectful, and we all had balls of wool in our pockets. And when the Greenham women started to appear, most of them had prepared statements. We webbed up the entire inside of the magistrates court, and they had to send the clerk out to get some scissors, and we did it with complete silence. Silence can be very powerful, but they had no idea, they had no idea what to do. And it was a very symbolic thing for us, because we were carrying Greenham home, and this was an example of how we were carrying Greenham home all across the country. And actually, that night I went back with a couple of mates, and we spray painted the Magistrates' Court green and women are everywhere. I'm going to move on now to Guerrilla Girls. There's a 4-minute video, and there's no sound, so I'm going to read out what's on the screen, assuming I can see it. I have to just move this thumbnail script out of the way. Mysteries of the where in this museum? Oh, MIA is the Minneapolis Institute of Art, and I like this video partly because it does include historical and craft things, which Batya mentioned about breaking down the divisions between fine art, which was a male world, and the craft and art produced by women that were often unnamed. So lots of objects in the art of Africa. And the American galleries, especially ceramics, were made by women. Although these artists were known and valued in their communities, we don't know how many of their names, because they didn't sign their work. What a difference today when genius and branding are crucial in promoting an artist's reputation. Could you be gender non-conforming and succeed as an artist in 19th century France? Yes, Rosa Bonheur was one of the most admired and financially successful artists in her time. She liked to present as masculine when painting in public and needed a police permit to do so. Some might say that was colluding. She also wore masculine clothes in her private life with her female partners. This reminds me of Gentleman Jack. More Somalis and Hmong live in Minnesota than anywhere else in the USA. How many of their artworks can be found in the museum? Only 2. One Somali work in the gallery and one Hmong work in another gallery. Are women artists at MIA? For centuries in Europe and America, obstacles were set up to keep females from becoming artists, yet in every era, women broke the rules and did it anyway. It's not easy to find these bold females at the MIA. Only 8 of 415 paintings and sculpture in the European and American galleries are by women. Why don't great quilts hang next to the great paintings? Quilts are considered craft. Paintings are considered art. Is this because most quilts are made by women? There are 90,000 artworks in Maya's collection. How many are by African American women? Only 49, with only 11 on display right now. Thank you. The Guerrilla Girls are still actually active. I'm not too sure what they're up to now, but they started in 1985 with doing street posters. They are a bunch of women artists who remain anonymous as Guerrilla Girls. That's why they wear the masks. And they were the sort of the things that they put on their posters initially were outside galleries, doing the facts. They name the lack of representation. They do the number crunching like we've just seen in that video. They took art out of the galleries because women weren't allowed in the galleries, and they worked collectively. So again, I think that links up with what Batya has been telling us about moving out of the galleries, moving onto the street and working collaboratively. They had a statement earlier on as well called The Advantages of Being a Woman Artist. This was also promoted through the New York Feminist Art Institute. And it could be some of them I'll read out. Working without the pressure of success. These are obviously slightly ironic, and they're an American statement. Not having to be in shows with men, having an escape from the art world in your 4 freelance jobs, knowing your career might pick up after you're 80, not being stuck in a tenured teaching position, seeing your ideas live on in the work of others, not having to choke on those big cigars or paint in Italian suits, being included in revised versions of art history, getting your picture in the art magazines wearing a gorilla suit. They moved into doing quite a few interviews. They were on television doing interviews about how they operated. So I'm going to now talk about the last thing. Yeah, Angela, I believe I've heard that recently, that they are under that illusion. Right, Suzanne Lacey also grew, she was born in 1945, so she grew out of this early movement. Mainly what we've been looking at is American, the world of American art and feminist artists. But I came across her in London in 2013. She also did a lot of socially engaged and public performance art. She did a big piece in the Tate Tanks it involved 400 women, and I was one of them, and it was called the Silver Action, which it was inviting women over 60 to be participants to come and represent the activism that they have been involved with in their lives, in their communities, in their political parties, strikes, public or private realm. So it was an all-day event, but it led that there was a lot of work leading up to the actual day in the tanks. There were the 400 women that were involved. We all went to on different days. We went to do a day workshop to meet each other and explore topics. And we've got 4 slides there, Bernadette. Number 1 is a slide of one of the workshops. Part of what we did was a timeline. So above the timeline, we were doing our own personal activism, and then below was what was happening in the world, momentous things that were happening in the world. There's another workshop. We were in discussion groups. We were given photographs to discuss and to swap stories and get our brains working. And then the next day, we were having conversations in the tanks around these tables, these small dinner tables, and we were invited by stewards to go and speak to scribes that were then projecting the words. We had 5 minutes to speak if we wanted to speak about this a topic of activism that we'd done, and it was being put onto the wall. That's the slide, the last slide, please, Bernadette. So the audience was looking down onto the tank. So these projections were easily read by the audience. They were not expected to be hearing the conversations at the table. The sound effects of like 40 women, 100 women at the tables in deep conversation was a sound in its own right, when it wasn't for listening to. The words were being projected onto the world, onto the walls, and it was I think it was quite an achievement to get this done. It was all done, as I said, in 2013, so we had the advantage of social media and stuff. Right, we've got a few questions coming up here. We've obviously provoked quite a lot of conversation, which is going to be great in the breakout room. Should we have a look at some of the chat?
Yeah, I just want to say this whole issue of nudity and I edit this journal FemSpec, and we get a lot of covers which we don't ever print because we don't want to expose, women's nudity that looks like pornographic images. But it can't be denied that a lot of women feel like they're reclaiming their own bodies from their own perspective. And if males look at women's bodies, it's from a male viewpoint. But if women artists are reclaiming their own bodies, they feel like it's from their viewpoint. So they feel like it's radical for them to be doing that. There's even one women art professor who wanted to get her picture on her bio in her art department was of her sitting there nude. And we wouldn't print it on our ed page as, a bio picture. And in the art world, that was very radical. And we weren't that radical a journal to do that, but she thought it was a radical way to present herself. So, it was and is happening. We've had photographs submitted of, women with chopped up body parts, and photographers think that they're reclaiming their sexual abuse as children when they make those kinds of pictures of women. And as an editor, I don't want to promote that kind of image. So it is a debate in the feminist art world, what you do with presenting women's bodies. And women claim if they present them, it's their point of view and it's not the male looking at their point of view. But I did want to say that this whole thing of the Women's Pentagon action, it wasn't limited to the Women's Pentagon action. We had similar actions in Seneca, the women's action. We had a farmhouse that was, a couple houses down from the a Seneca Army Depot, and we did performance art. I had a piano in the back of my truck, and we drove it around the Army Depot, playing music, trying to get the right chord that would make the Army depots fall down. And then we did hula dancing with bamboo pieces of wood, trying to make music to make the Army depot fall down. And so we did performance music, and dance was a big thing too. So we were reclaiming women's art and music to do them in public, to show that they were women's art and to suggest that they had power. And there was a lot of jumping over the fence and civil disobedience, but there was also using art as a way to protest in the American anti-war demonstrations. And I wanted to point out that one of those pictures of the mourning of the women who died was Love Canal. That was not an army death, that was an environmental illness death. So if people didn't know what the Love Canal was, it wasn't a war. it was an area that had environmental pollution that people were dying from. So, anyway, and I wanted to I wanted to point out that you had said that in one of our earlier chats, Ray, that the women from Greenham had also used tampons up on the fence, right?
Yeah.
So using that. So
Yeah.
a lot of these local art were thought of at the same time in different parts of the world. And I think that was an interesting point that we discovered when we were preparing.
Yeah, and another of the names that was on the tombstones was Karen Silkwood, and she was murdered as an environmental activist as well. I mean, the thing that struck me that was so different at the New York Feminist Art Institute, it was all women. It was a women-only space. The tutors were women. If we were life modeling, we were in a private space. And I can remember being in like a CR group where we all got speculums out and looked at our vulvas and vaginas into our vaginas. So, but they were in a women-only space, and they were reclaiming. Well, they were claiming something that we hadn't even had before. And also you'd mentioned that there was, I mean, at the Pentagon Action, I met a photographer who was from Philadelphia, and I went to stay with her after my time in New York, and she was doing part-time teaching. There was a Women's Arts Institute in Philadelphia as well, and then I went down to Houston, and it was a similar thing. There were women-only art classes, art groups. I just can't imagine how that would happen now. So I and then the thing about Greenham was that a lot of it was performance. The web weaving and the what we hung on the fence was decorative. Women brought what they want. There were no rules or constrictions. I put sanitary towels with red paint on, and a lot of women were quite offended by that, but others brought teddy bears and brought what you want, but the unifying thing was the wool and the web weaving, which was a common thread. It was a common thread. So looking at the chat and getting distracted. Consciousness raising groups.
The women were raising their consciousness, and there was a lot of poetry writing about menstrual cycles, and women were reclaiming their bodies in so many different ways. And I don't think there was a boundary about looking at bodies being different from writing about bodies. And I was in a poetry women's writing workshop at a bookstore. We had women's bookstores at that time, and there were small groups for lots of different ways of creating. So it wasn't only in the art institutes, and the women's art galleries were amazing. So women could have their own art exhibits. Do you remember whether the art exhibits that women had that had only women viewers, like Mary Daly's classes had only women students? Do you remember any of the art galleries only allowing women in?
No, I didn't get to galleries very much. But
I don't remember whether the women art galleries only let women in either.
Another thing that I'd like to go back to with the Pentagon Action is that there was a process. I mean, that was the thing with the Suzanne Lacey as well. Art isn't just a final product. There's a process involved, whether you're just working individually as an artist, or whether you're working collectively and collaboratively. There's a process. So the part of the process that I've understood the Pentagon Action to be was actually how we work through our despair at the situation. And so the first thing, it's an emotional journey. The process of being an artist is an emotional journey. So the first thing that we do is mourn and name your losses, and that can include men. They were sons of mothers. Then the rage thing is like, when you actually look at the loss and the mourning that we do, you know, you can't just get stuck in mourning. You have to be angry about it, but you can't get stuck in anger either. So that anger, that's the third stage, moving from anger into empowerment, was like, well, what are we going to do about it? We can join together and increase our strength. And then what do you do with that? Empowerment isn't the end point either. It's part of a process. And then you move into defiance. And that's what the last stage of it was, which is taking direct action in a non-violent way. And as we saw yesterday, it doesn't stop the men being violent, it exposes their violence.
Mhm.
And I think
About
that
art being a Yeah, the Michigan Women's Music Festival used to have a over 40s tent, and every year there would be an art gallery and women could bring their art and put it up in the gallery in the over 40s tent. But there also used to be a quilt making project, and during the whole week women would participate in a collective making of a quilt, and women came there to make a quilt together, which would be raffled off and given away at the end of the week, as well as to see individual women's art. So there was this collectivity and individual art making and showcasing at the same time. It was an amazing gallery.
Friendship quilts, they were called friendship quilts. Well, this side of the pond, they were called friendship quilts. So another example of a performance that we did at Greenham, it was again, it was a big process. It was an all-weekend thing, and it was quite theatrical. Someone had put together a little performance play about the four or five examples of patriarchs. So there was the military patriarch, the surgeon, the doctor's patriarch, the New Age patriarch, and the aristocracy. So we I can't remember the details of it, but I think I became the religious patriarch, and there was a story around it. And when we performed it, we had a big flatback lorry, and we went to each of the gates around the base. It took all day, and there were different women at different gates, and we did this performance about the makeup of patriarchy, and particularly that it was actually naming the New Age patriarchs as well.
And the women in black in Jerusalem used to, well, in all of the cities of Israel, used to stand all dressed in black in a circle and not talk, not speak. And they would have people honk and yell and throw eggs at them and then there was this one guy who used to go around and hand everybody a rose. And so it was a performance piece of, make love, not war. And but so I mentioned the showing the slides on the street. That was an early stage of the demonstration, but it began to be a performance piece where you had to dress in black or stand to the side. There was a costume. And it was that mourning thing that you were talking about. They were mourning the deaths of people who died in the territories.
That women in black still do those silent protests in London.
They do them all over the world.
Yeah, I did some in Belgrade during the war, during the in former Yugoslavia, and women in black in Belgrade did that every week, all through the war, and it was silent. It was very, very striking, because it was silent. They were dressed in black. And they all, I nearly was going to put some photographs of this in, but they were holding big placards just stating facts and figures, and saying, not in my name, I'm not condoning part of this at all.
Yeah, there was a beauty pageant in I think it was in Peru, where the women, instead of the numbers of their breasts, hips and waist, they said the numbers of women who had died from femicide and women who'd been battered. And so there's also an element of performance art of seizing the moment and the place. And that's like what installation art is, and turning it on its head. And you can read about this in Sisterhood is Powerful, which was a collection by edited by Robin Morgan in 1970. There's a section on the witches who were, there was actually a group of women who went and did a hex on Wall Street, and they dressed up like witches to do the hex. So there was I think it was in 1968. So that was another piece of performance art, which used the place as a way to make a political and artistic statement. That wasn't necessarily about exposing women's role. It was about exposing Wall Street, but using women historically, the power historically to expose Wall Street. So that was more direct political action as well, along this vein.
And it's very different doing that sort of thing with a women only affinity group and direct action than the mixed stuff that we see, for example, with Extinction Rebellion. It just feels very different. It feels safer, and you tend to do that work building trust and creating affinity group before you go out and do that.
It's very different from, I went to the 1971, if they won't stop the war, if the government won't stop the war, we'll stop the government. And we all ended up in jail, and if all we are saying is give peace a chance, singing on our knees, and they came with billy clubs and put us in, buses and put us in the stadium and put us in jail. And so there was a lot of, it was supposed to be a nonviolent action, but it wasn't theatrical. So for some reason, do you know why we weren't all arrested in 81 action? Did they have permits to do that?
Well, at the Pentagon action, there were arrests.
Yeah, we weren't all. There were arrests?
Yeah,
I was
in the first, in 1980, there were 140 arrests, and in 1981 there were 65 arrests. And I think some of them on the second year had been arrested on the first year, and they got much longer prison terms. I think the first time arresters,
they did.
Yeah, the first time arresters were just sort of given a caution or something.
Yeah. Well, I think like the Women in Black used to make their demo only an hour so that more women could participate. And I think the Women in Pentagon Action, they made it so that you could participate without getting arrested. Like you could participate in the morning column and leave if you didn't want to participate in the section that was going to get arrested. And I just participated in the morning column because I'd driven in with a woman from the bookstore. We'd driven across country to be in the demo. So that's what
my group told me that I shouldn't get arrested because I wasn't American and I'd get deported. But I was still in a group, and I can't remember what they all do. But there was I know that I planted a tombstone. I can't remember the name of the woman. I found it incredibly inspiring.
Mm-hmm. There was a lot of, at Seneca, not only the protesting at the gate was done in art forms, but I remember my van died and I took all the pieces of the engine and made a matriarchal consciousness out of the patriarchal machine and did a circle of the pieces of the engine. And I painted big goddesses on the outhouses. And there was just a lot of creativity at the camp being expressed, not only at this site, but there was a lot of song singing and creativity in lots of ways was just bursting out at the camp, and it attracted encampment attracted a lot of creative women.
Yeah, and particularly celebrating the earth as our mother. At Greenham, it was very much, and there was a strong sense of ecofeminism. So yeah. Any more we've got a few minutes left. Anything else in the chat? Or we've got some Q&A as well. We'd like to share an alternative vision of the Guerrilla Girls, the advantages. How can we do this? Well, it'd be interesting to create our own version, the advantages of being a woman artist. Is everything made by women radical feminist art? No, I don't think so. And I think that's why we were looking at process and collaborative working as well, and taking it out of the institutions.
Our topic was feminist artists. It wasn't necessarily radical feminist artists. We were talking about the feminist art movement, which wasn't necessarily radical. That wasn't in our title, precisely because of this. There are a lot of people who criticized Judy Chicago. We didn't talk about the dinner party because some people thought that she did not attribute the individual work of two individual women, and therefore it was exploitative of the women who worked on the project. So I talked about Woman House because it was attributed to the individual women who worked on it. You can find their names when you look at the project. So, you know, feminism was bursting out. It wasn't all divided and labeled, you know. Well, I'm working on a mural here at the art annex of the Museum of Motherhood, and I get introduced as a second wave icon. Well, at that point, we weren't the second wave. We weren't this, we weren't that. We were just doing what we were doing. We weren't all particularly labeled. I mean, there was infighting among the different sections, but not everybody thought of themselves as a certain kind of feminist. We were just doing what we were doing, many of us.
And learning from each other.
Learning from each other. As we did the art, we were learning. Like, did you think the Feminist Art Institute were they labeled as radical feminists necessarily, or they were just doing what they were doing was radical, right?
Well, for me, what they were doing was radical. You know, to do woodwork and carpentry was a bit radical for a woman. Learning from a woman, I'd done car mechanics in Bristol, and it was taught by women, and it was all women in the students. So there's nothing radical about car mechanics, but in that, if you're doing it in that way and in that context, to me, that was quite radical in the 80s. It was, the whole.
That's why Judy was teaching everyone to use power tools.
Yeah.
And the Women's Inner Art Center, they weren't calling themselves radical feminists. They were just doing radical work, but they weren't labeling themselves because they wanted to be inclusive to all women that wanted to learn and participate. And the grant, they didn't label themselves radical feminists. They were just women. It was a different time.
And like the Feminist Art Institute, most of the courses were part-time. They were evening classes, which made them much more accessible. You couldn't, not everyone could be a full-time art student. So that was increasing the accessibility as well. Oh, well, yeah. We'll have to press on with this in the breakout rooms. Thank you for all the comments. We haven't really managed to keep up with them.
Is it time? Okay, thank you very much. And we look forward to the breakout.
Thanks, bye-bye. Thanks, Batya.